Hello, everyone. I am Carla Kopp. This is a game design live chat. I am a board game designer, publisher, and developer, and we're here today with Joseph Chen, who is the designer and artist for Fantastic Factories, and he also co-owns Metafactory Games. Joseph, can you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I got into game design, a few years back, and we launched the Kickstarter for Fantastic Factories along with my friend and co-founder Justin Faulkner. And yeah, it's been a wild ride. We had a really successful first campaign, and this past year we launched a Kickstarter for the expansions and a second printing, and that went amazingly well as well. We raised we over like 4,000 backers. I forget the exact dollar amount, but it's been really cool so far.
Yes, it's really exciting to see all the things you're doing because well, I met you. I feel like 3 years ago at maybe PAX Unplugged
That sounds
I
about
don't know.
right. Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot. Or rather, we interfaced a bit, on like Twitter, I think, and I think that's one of the cool things about conventions. You get good opportunity to meet the people that you interact with, and I think it was in the Unpub area. Where it played Stellar Leap. I think it was
Yeah,
after you had published it already. I think, or it was like you had done the Kickstarter, but it hadn't quite hit stores yet.
I think that's what I remember is well, I remember playing Fantastic Factories in the Unpub room, and I liked it at that point, and it got even better by the final thing, which is normal and everything. Um, but today our topic is pricing and um So a lot of people don't understand what goes into making the MSRP. So what matters for you when you're determining what the MSRP should be?
So I think a lot of it depends on your goals as a creator, like what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to make money, start a company, or just put something out there that you want people to play. But speaking in general, I think when you consider MSRP of your game and you're trying to sell to consumers, you need to basically look at what other games are out there and what they're priced at. And in order to get people to buy your game, you have to at least be a little bit competitive. Why would I buy your game when I can buy Azul for like $40 with all these components? So, like, the one thing I would recommend you do is consider what components are in your game. Find a game that's similar and comparable and has a reasonable amount of popularity, and just see like, okay, what are they pricing at? And that, I think, was one of the kind of starting points in considering what you should set your MSRP. I mean, there's a lot of other factors too in terms of like costs, and you don't want to be selling your game at a price where you're losing money. And so a lot of publishers, they use, or they like to talk about the 5x rule, which basically there's a cost calculation where how much it costs for you to manufacture the game and how much it costs to freight it over from the factory, usually like China, over to the US. That's considered the something called the landed cost, and a lot of publishers like to use a 5x or sometimes even like 7x rule. So 5x the landed cost sets your MSRP. But that said, if that number ends up being much larger than like what the market demands or what other games are selling, then you're not going to sell your game very well. So in an ideal world, your 5 or 7x landed cost is the same or less than your target MSRP uh, compared to other games on the market. I mean, there's
So
a lot to unpack there.
yes, there is a lot to unpack. Well, especially with the freight because so many new creators they don't well, before you know what the freight is, you have to decide how many copies of the game that you're going to get. If you do want to sell into retail, you should get more games so that you can actually sell. Um, which, if you do get more games, that lowers the price. But without knowing the exact freight cost, you don't know if you should get copies for retail. Like as you said, if you're going to lose money, you shouldn't do it, and you need to price it as much around what other people are doing.
Yeah,
So
it's yeah. Sorry, go
oh,
ahead.
go on. Oh,
Well, yeah, it's just impossible challenge for publishers, and it's why it's so hard because well before you actually manufacture, you need to price out your Kickstarter, you need to set your pledge levels, and at that point, you don't know how many games you're going to manufacture. And the lot more games you manufacture, the cheaper the game's going to be, right? The manufacture. The cost of manufacturing a game at 1,000 quantity versus 5,000. It's a huge difference, probably like a 50% difference potentially. And so that really affects your cost calculation as well as like freight. So like freight, you know, larger quantity means you can have better costs per unit, um, as well as like retail. So let's say you have 1,000 backers, so you need at least 1,000 games. But how well is it going to sell in retail? You want to chat with distributors, but as a first-time publishers, distributors don't want to talk to you. Um, so do you order 2,000 copies, do you 3,000 or 1,500? So these are all really you have to have a crystal ball. You have to make your best guess, and that's where it's really challenging to be a publisher because you need to understand the market, read the market, and hopefully not over manufacture or under manufacture in order to hit the right price point.
So, how did you come to the number that you did for Fantastic Factories and how many to?
So we knew that we needed about 5,000 ish for backers because we had close to 5,000 backers, and really it's a bit of a shot in the dark. So one of the things I tried to do is talk to distributors, um, and most of them kind of gave me the same similar story of like, well, they didn't want to really commit to any numbers, and being a first time publisher that hasn't actually finished manufacturing a game, like it's hard for distributors to say like, yeah, I want X number of copies. Early on, we had one distributor who was interested in potentially going in for a couple thousand, but in the end, it didn't quite work out. But I did speak with some other publishers, who have gone down the Kickstarter route, and they were able to give me their opinion about like how well they thought the game might do in retail based on the cost, the components, the gameplay, and just the art and look. Um, in the end, I think also it depends on how much money you have available, right? You can't unless you want to pour your own funds into it. The amount of money you have to work with is the Kickstarter funds you've raised, as well as reserving a pretty significant chunk of money for fulfillment. Of course, you don't want to end up in a situation where you have the games but you can't mail them out because you ran out of money, which unfortunately happens all too often with a lot of board game Kickstarters. So in the end, we printed 10,000 copies, and it's so funny looking back because I think almost immediately afterwards, when we started fulfilling, and it felt like maybe we had ordered too many. Uh, because 2x, 5,000 extra copies, that's not a small amount to like sell through. Um, and then we partnered with Deepwater Games to help us sell, and then the pandemic hit. So it was like all this crazy stuff going on, and the pandemic really hurt sales. But then, as I think people kind of got used, well, I don't know if got used to it is something we could never really say about the whole pandemic situation, but sales ended up bouncing back, especially given the strong solo gameplay that Fantastic Factories has. We actually sold out of games, I think, in the third quarter of 2020. And so right now it's actually very hard to find copies. And so in that sense, we maybe underprinted or perhaps should have pulled the trigger on reprinting it. So it's just really difficult to get the right number.
Oh, for sure. So are you in talks of reprinting?
Oh yeah, so the part of the second Kickstarter campaign, we were also there's a pledge level for the base game, and that will also basically fund the reprint. And it's either being printed now or very shortly. I think we Deepwater approved the proofs very recently.
And how many do you think, or did you decide to print this time?
Uh, that's a good question. I think they've told. It's interesting because now that we're partner with Deepwater, they handle a lot of those kind of numbers. They do tell us, uh, and I actually can't remember. It's probably somewhere between 5 and 8,000 is my guess. Um, but yeah, it's uh, but I think now that we have kind of settled into like the cadence, it'll be a little easier to say print another run, etc.
For sure. That is really exciting though that you are printing another large batch of games.
Yeah,
I think
that's kind of the hope from any publisher, right? Is to be able to reprint the game over and over again. Um, is it's certainly less work to hit reprint than the design and art direct and everything for a new whole new title.
was there anything that you changed between the first print run and the second?
So for the most part, no. I believe so. We changed manufacturers, so there's a bit of like cardstock matching that we had to do. I think we ended up dropping the wooden first player token, because which is it doesn't necessarily add too much to the experience, and it was kind of a cost cutting thing. But there are also a few minor rule book adjustments. So there was like one typo where like the card quantity is wrong, and then we discovered through just having thousands of people play the game, certain rules were maybe a little confusingly written. So basically fixed up those little pieces here and that there from like player feedback. Just like okay, they thought this was the most confusing part of the rule book, so we reworded it, tried tried it out a little bit, and basically made some adjustments there.
Yeah. It's always interesting to see like when I send out a game. Like I do a lot of blind play testing and a lot of proofreading on the rule books, but there's always like something that like people get like wrong or they just have questions about that I just do not anticipate. Just purely because like you can blind play test a lot, but you can't blind play test 5,000 times.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. It's crazy. The first day that your game gets played, it's gonna be played more times than you've ever play tested it. So it's impossible to cover all the cases, but you do the best you can.
I really like the that I never thought about it where like the first month a Kickstarter gets sent out, it's most likely being played like more than it's ever have before. And it's just good to point that out. Because like we can play test a lot. Like you play tested for what, like 2 or 3 years?
Yeah, it was a couple years, and I mean, there's also like as you play test, you're tweaking the game, so like the final iteration of the game is not as many. You know, you didn't play the final version for 2 years either. So yeah, it's despite all of those times, just things still pop up, and that's why it's so important also to not necessarily dismiss something as a one-off. So I think like a lot of people, their natural tendencies when they see a problem with their game, they have kind of some people might have a bit of defensiveness to say like, oh well, I didn't think that rule was confusing, but someone else thought the rule was confusing. Be you might tend to like brush it off and say, okay, maybe that was just a one-off. That person just is an isolated case, but times 5,000, there's bound to be people who also have that same confusion. So it's often hard to tell, like, kind of draw a signal from the noise, but it's really important to try to pay attention to every piece of feedback that you get.
That is very good because yeah, like just because it's only one person, it can end up being like 100 or something, and 100 people like shouting is a lot, is something you should deal with probably.
Yeah, easier to deal with it before you hit print than after.
Oh, for sure. Um, we had one question from the audience. When evaluating price, is there any good way to quantify the value added for a special component? Kind of like you talked about with the wooden first player token. Um, their example was in Wingspan. It didn't need to have the bird feeder dice tower as a component, but it adding it added value and experience to the game. Um, After finding out how much it would cost to include such a special component in your final product, how would you decide if something like that is worth?
Yeah, it's really a hard question because almost by definition, special components are like less comparable than others, right? Basically, I would say, from a publishing standpoint, what do you need to include in your game to help it sell? And when you look at Wingspan, like what are the interesting components they've got? They've got the eggs, they've got the cool trays, and I guess admittedly with those combinations, you wouldn't necessarily need that bird feeder dice tower thing. Um, and how much does that experience add to how much does that component add to the game experience? And I don't know the details of like um, how much playtesting went into that component, which is I guess a whole another interesting thing. You know, most of the time when we talk about playtesting, we talk about gameplay, but there's also component experience to consider. And I think what is nice is it differentiates your game. So like when people are comparing two games, and one game has this special component, it's much harder to say like this game isn't worth it because this other game has the same components but is cheaper. So I think especially for games that have fewer components in general, or components that are very basic, like just cards mostly. So Wingspan at its core is like cards, a board, and tokens, which they've chosen to do with the eggs. And you want your MSRP to also match the game experience. You know, you don't want to spend $100 for a game that runs for 10 minutes. Likewise, it seems weird to only spend $20 on like a massive sprawling campaign that is expected to be 2 hour games, 2 hour session per game. So in some ways, if you want your experience to match the price, you might add in extra components in order to set that expectation, I think. So if you think the game is a $50 experience and your components don't say $50, then that's a good opportunity to like consider adding in some of these kind of special components. And also one thing to consider specifically for the bird feeder, if I remember correctly, it's made from chipboard. So uh, chipboard, I would guess is relatively cheap compared to say like a 3D plastic molded uh, thing or anything like that. So it's also interesting to consider like the perceived value of like a whole 3D bird feeder when in reality it's just more chipboard, which is a pretty standard board game component you see often. So there's kind of a cost versus benefit analysis as well there.
Yeah, that is a very important point. Which is why I also did the dice tower for Tumbletown because we were getting like a certain amount of chipboard and it was an increased cost to get more chipboard, but it wasn't all that much more. Partly also because like components, if you're already putting in chipboard, like that is the physical cost of putting in the thing. Um and if you already have like the physical cost of like putting each different type of item into a game box is a large portion of the cost that a lot of like new publishers or game players don't think about um the like human interaction. So if you're already doing the human interaction, like adding in another sheet of chipboard is, you know, not that much more.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also like the effort of like setting up the chipboard, the tooling, the proofing, and so if you're doing two sheets of chipboard, adding a third piece is not that much overhead in comparison.
Mhm. So, going back to like the Kickstarter where you mentioned like you don't know how many games that you're gonna make, so you don't really know what the landed cost will be when you're first setting up um your Kickstarter pledge levels. How do you do that?
So the nice thing about Kickstarter is that it's effectively direct sales. So you actually are able to capture a lot more profit margin than you would say selling to wholesale. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room there. So when people say 5x or 7x landed costs, that's intended to be used as a kind of a measuring stick for how sustainable your print runs are. So if you're able to sell your game at 5 or 7x, landing costs. That means after you sell through your run, you will minus fixed costs. You'll be able to have enough money to do a second print run of the similar size. That said, a lot of first-time Kickstarter creators, they aren't necessarily looking for a second print run, or that's a little too far along the future. So what I would generally recommend, or what kind of advice I'd give is, you want to price it so people will buy it, but you want to price it so people will buy it and you don't lose money. And there's actually a pretty decent amount of wiggle room there, given that Kickstarter is direct sales. And you could also print only as many as you need in order to make sure you also don't lose money. Um, so there's if your Kickstarter basically just hits your goal, then you might be in a spot where you just don't make any money. But if your Kickstarter hits like 5x your goal, then you might start seeing some of that profit come in the form of like the economies of scale, and you might be able to reinvest that money in a larger print run to also sell in retail. So I think basically you have to consider, what is the MSRP for your game that makes sense? How much does it cost? You basically have to do all the cost calculation, make sure you're not losing money. And if the two don't line up, or you don't aren't going to be making any money, then you kind of have to revisit the drawing board and think, okay, should I get a different manufacturer? Should I change the components of my game? Or am I willing to risk some of my own personal money to make this project happen if it doesn't fund as well as you would hope?
Mhm. Yeah, whenever I am like making a Kickstarter, I usually like include how much money that I could put in for the overall goal, just because like, well, at the Kickstarter point, usually people have already like put in thousands of dollars um
Mhm.
through art and getting reviewer copies and all of that. Luckily for you, you are also the artist Fantastic Factories. Um, that was
Yeah,
just a time cost for you, which is it's still valuable, but like it's harder to put a monetary value on. Um, was there anything that you would change for all your pricing with the Kickstarter and stretch goals and whatnot?
I think for the first campaign, I think we hit a pretty magical combination. I think one of my concerns when I was doing some analysis on like Kickstarter campaigns is, um, you typically see board games that are either like impulse buys, so they're priced at like $15 to $20, or you see like the big sprawling like minis games that are like $80 to $100. And my concern was like, okay, for these like mid lightweight Euro type games around the $40 price point, like is there is there space for it on Kickstarter? And well, I guess the answer is yes, but it's still unclear to me how large of an audience that is. But I think for Fantastic Factories, we have the MSRP at 40, but we did the Kickstarter at 29 plus $6 shipping. But and just to be clear, the shipping was subsidized by us, partially, half the cost. And so we're really just, for myself and Justin, we didn't believe in like overly uh elaborate components. We wanted to focus more on the gameplay of the game, so we decided to see how aggressive of a price we could put it. And we priced it at $29. And I think for first time creators, and a lot of publishers, they say don't give a discount for your Kickstarter, and I'm not sure I necessarily not necessarily agreeing with that, especially for a first time creator. It's hard with so much competition out there to stand out among all the other excellent publishers out there that are also using Kickstarter. And so for us personally, I think that going for an aggressive price point for our first campaign, $29, was the right choice. I think it created a lot of momentum. It built a really large fan base for our game. And the fact is also that does cut heavily into your profits. And it depends on once again, what your goals are. Do you want to run a second campaign? Um, and for Justin and me, we just wanted to get our game out there to as many people as possible without losing any money, right? and potentially for in a sustainable way where we're building a business where we can continue releasing games or expansions. And I think with those goals in mind, I think that the pricing that we did hit the mark. Um, and you also asked about stretch goals, which is a whole interesting topic on its own. Um, and for one, I think kind of unique thing for our campaign was that we only did component upgrade stretch goals, and this is kind of a personal philosophy or a kind of thing of my own. Is like when you design a game and you present to the people, you want it to be like the complete game, gameplay wise. So I didn't want to dangle like gameplay components in front of backers. And the reality is, a lot of publishers, they design and create all these things ahead of time with the intention that they are going to include it, and that the stretch goals are often just um, like a carrot on the stick that they intend on giving to the backers in the end anyways, because you've already sunk all your costs into developing it. And what happens, for instance, to the game balance if you don't include that element? um, so I didn't want to play that kind of game with backers, and I just want to include all the gameplay elements up front. But as backers come in and we're able to do a larger print run, there are cost savings for us. And our basically what we decided to do is reinvest those into upgrading the components. So upfront at the very beginning, before we reveal any stretch goals, we want to say like, well, if there are any stretch goals, they're going to be component based only, because we've designed the game, we've tested the game in its entirety in terms of the gameplay, and that's what we're delivering. And everything else is just better tactile pieces, things like that.
Mhm. I'm the same way where I just like the component upgrades. They're nice and they're easy and well, as you say with the play testing and the experience, like you want that experience to be really good. You don't want to take anything away or potentially add something that hasn't been thoroughly play tested, that you'll need like months and months after the fact to just make sure is okay. Um, so yeah, it's definitely less stressful to do component upgrades. Like hopefully there's nothing there that will, like, really change. You did bring up shipping, when you were talking about your Kickstarter pledge levels, where you talked about it was, 29 with $6, dollars shipping. Tell me more about that, like, how did you decide on that for the ship?
Yeah, so I think Amazon has spoiled us a little bit in the world of free shipping, and so it's really tricky because first I'll start off with this number. I think a lot of people don't understand this, how overwhelming shipping costs are. So for Fantastic Factories, and I don't think this is unique for us by any means, is that shipping the games costs more than 2x the cost of manufacturing the game. So it costs more than twice the amount to ship it to people than actually manufacture the game. So like let that sink in for a moment. So that is a cost you definitely do not want to underestimate, and you need to make sure you keep funds in the bank account to pay that once the time comes, because fulfillment is the last step. It's also a very important step. But that said, um, I think first of all, free shipping is nice, but it hides it basically you're forced to someone has to pay for it, right? And so free shipping means that the publisher has to pay for it. And what that ends up being is that the price that you put on your game is going to be high, have to be higher, right? Instead of $29. So I could have done $29, $6 shipping. That's what I did. But I could have done $35 free shipping. And um, that is a possibility. Or I could have, so I subsidized about $6 or $7 of it. So the real cost of shipping was like $12. Now, if I just added that in, then um, the Kickstarter pledge would have been like $41. And that doesn't look great when the MSRP of the game is $40. Why would Kickstarter backers, uh, pay more than retail for the game that they are putting money in early. So that's also where like the Kickstarter discount, I believe, it makes sense. But it's really about optics. So basically, I want the consumer to pay for part of the cost because I think by now they understand that shipping is a thing. It costs. Someone has to pay for it. But at the same time, $12 shipping on a $40 game, like you, I think there's kind of a psychology behind it. You know, you don't want to spend. I think my general rule of thumb is you don't want to spend more than like 25% of the price of the thing you're buying in the cost of shipping. It just feels bad to like, oh, I'm buying this thing, but also like, oh, a third of the cost is just paying for the shipping. It doesn't feel like you're getting good value. And so it's a psychological element. So my strategy has often been to subsidize the price of shipping to the point where it's less than 25% of the actual pledge level. That's kind of where I aim for. And there's some other things going on there, like $29 is, uh, as much as people like to have like the round numbers, I really do believe, and there's been a lot of studies that say like 29 is going to sell better than 30. That whole like leading number thing. So that's how we ended up with $29 and splitting the subsidy of the shipping in half.
So, with the whole like psychology of that, you said that the MSRP for Fantastic Factories was $40.
Yep.
How did you get to that price instead of like 39 or 39.99 or
I guess when I that's fair, perfectly fair. I actually don't know whether it's 39.99 or 40. I think in the end that's kind of a consumer facing thing. So I guess it's up to the retailers. I don't know. Actually, I'm not sure what the official amount is. And I think when I said it, I wasn't necessarily thinking as far ahead as retail when we initially did it. So it's possible it might be 39.99, and ultimately, I think that psychology element is what affects consumers most more so than say retailers.
Mhm.
So unfortunately, I don't actually know the exact answer of where that's at, but also it ends up being like ultimately the retailer to decide whether they end their numbers of 40 straight or 39.99.
Mhm. Um, yeah, it was just something I was thinking of because Tumbletown's going to retail this month, and I was looking at the list of games that were going to retail, and some people do the straight like, oh, it's 39. Some of them were doing 39.95 or 39.99 or the 40, and it seems like there's not a cohesive what all the publishers do.
Yeah,
We all
and
just
I
make choices.
yeah, and I was just speaking 40 as kind of a, even if it is 39.99, it's a lot easier to in conversation to say 40.
Mhm.
So I don't know what it's actually listed at. But also curious about the whole 95 thing, which I wonder if there's some psychology around that too.
Yeah, I've seen prices, like, I feel like I remember growing up that, like, books were always, like, 95, but, not a lot of other things were?
I've heard that at some retailers like Costco, you can actually read into the end price as an indication of whether it's a new item, it's a item that is going out of stock, or something that they put on discount. It's like a secret code where like if it ends with 95, it means it's like it's on sale. If it ends 99, it means it's like a new item or something like that. So,
Oh, that is very interesting.
but that I'm sure it differs for each retailer. So I don't know what it means when it's, being sold to retailers from a distributor.
Who knows? Um, so, now that, Fantastic Factories is with, their backers, you're on the 2nd, Kickstarter, how long after, the game has been fulfilled, or in retail stores do you think publishers should wait before offering the game at a discount?
That's a good question, and one that I don't have great experience with, given that Deepwater's handled most of the sales of even the first Kickstarter campaign. But I can kind of talk through like what I think makes sense. I mean, if your game is selling well, I there's not really any reason to like offer a discount, right? Uh, there is cost to holding on the games, like warehousing costs, right? And and also there's kind of the lifetime of your game, so you have to decide, does this game seem like an evergreen title? Like if I just had a stock of this game, would it continue to sell month over month, or is this the kind of game where the sales drop off after a while? In which case, like the warehousing costs are going to eventually exceed the cost of or exceed the profit you're actually making. Um, and so I think those are kind of all the considerations. At some point, I guess you have to decide that uh, this game is not selling much anymore, and to just, I don't, dump is kind of a harsh word, I guess, but um, in some cases that might be the reality of it, just dumping a game and moving on to the next. But that said, also there's different consumers have different price sensitivity, and when you have a website that has direct sales, you also have the opportunity to potentially offer like sales and discounts. Basically, when the MSRP is 40, but if you can sell at 35, you're still making money. So ideally, when you put something on sale for 35, you're only selling to people who are only willing to buy it at 35 and not at 40. And so you can kind of do that in the form of like time limited sales and things like that. So those are all kind of options to explore. So there's not necessarily a good straight answer here, but I would say that like there is a cost to holding games, and so when that cost rises more than, or rises considerably compared to the amount of profit you're making, and there may be time to start moving the inventory a little faster.
Mhm. So going back to Kickstarter, what was the biggest surprise you had with running your first?
Yeah, so everyone is going to ask every possible question ever. So yeah, and you want to be prepared for those. And a lot of those questions surround like shipping and bundling and things like that. And they'll be like, uh, I mean, looking back, some of these questions seem so obvious, but it just, despite all our preparation, maybe wasn't so obvious, I guess. So we had like a 2 game pledge level, but then there's a question of like, well, what do I do if I want to order 3 games? And we weren't using a pledge manager for the first game. And so like, what if I want 3? What if I want 4? What if I do I get a discount if I order 10 or 20? And just questions around those kind of things. And it's simpler when you only have one thing you're selling, which is like the base game. But in the second campaign, there's also the question of like, what if I want 2 copies of the bundle, or a copy of this bundle and this other bundle, or mix and match? What does the base, like, what's the difference between the second printing and the first printing? Every possible question backers going to have, they're going to ask. And once the campaign starts, it's going to be this crazy flurry of like doing customer service, responding to comments, and ideally you can anticipate all these questions ahead of time. Like that way you can quickly respond. You don't have to ask uh, your collaborators, and like, sometimes you want to make sure you have the one clear answer that everyone on your team agrees this is the answer to that question, and this is how we're handling it. Because sometimes I find myself, I'll respond to comments, you know, and then there'll be a tricky question where I don't know the answer, and so I have to talk to like Deepwater Games and say, okay, what's our stance on this? Um, and then to backers, it'll look like I just skipped the question because I didn't want to answer it. And the reality is not I didn't want to answer it. I just need to look up, figure out, discuss what the answer is, because it's a trickier question. And so trying to get ahead of all these things, that I think that was the thing that kind of surprised me, is all the different questions. And basically, if your campaign's large enough, you got enough backers, someone will ask that question.
Mhm. Oh, for sure. Like all the questions, especially now, like since we're in a pandemic, I've noticed that people are a lot more passionate about things that they, just weren't in the past. Or maybe Kickstarter has grown to a certain level. Um Is there anything like that that you noticed where people are either, like, more passionate nowadays or just asking, like, very specific questions?
I think it depends on like the size of the campaign and a little bit of luck. So it's funny because a lot of like the weird stuff that you get will just be from like one or two backers, and it's interesting because they like to engage, but sometimes the way they engage is not the most productive way of engaging with creators. There's always a few of them, um, and that's just part of doing business on Kickstarter is addressing those people, answering their questions, and uh, figuring out all those weird things. It's hard to say if there's like a trend of it or not, given how infrequent. It's hard to say in aggregate whether that's the case or not. But I would say like people do have more time on their hands at home in general, I'd say. So I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
So what's one thing that you tell someone who's about to create their first Kickstarter campaign?
So one thing I like to suggest, if it's possible, is to find like a co-creator, someone to partner with. Because a lot of Kickstarter is about, well, there's a lot of things about Kickstarter, but one thing is that understanding that a lot of people who are Kickstarter creators, they start as designers, they design a game. But when you're on Kickstarter, what you're selling is less of a design and more of a product. And I think that mind shift is really um, hard for some people to kind of wrap their minds around. And part of being a product is like perception. Like, is this a good value? Is this a good game? Or what does it look like to people? And I think having a second person who is just as invested as you can really help put things in perspective, because you might think it's the best game in the world. You might think that the art looks great, but having a second person who is not afraid to tell you like this is not working, this art is not good, or the game doesn't work, because a lot of your friends and family, they're gonna try to be supportive, and the way they think they're supportive is to say what you're doing is good. But when you have someone who has just as much skin in the game as you, they're much more likely to call out real issues because they're invested. They don't want to launch it. They don't want to spend all this money and time into a Kickstarter and just have it fall flat. So basically, finding someone who is just as invested as you, and if you're not able to do that, like find a community that you trust. It's a safe place where people can openly like discuss and criticize, your project, your game, and really give you that strong feedback. I think that's probably one of the most important things about launching a Kickstarter game.
I definitely agree. Finding that person might be really hard, but being able to talk truthful about things and having people that are objective, and thinking of it as a product. I will go with you on the whole, like, it's hard to think about a game as a product because, like, you can get so much feedback from people that are playing the game, and they might tell you that it's fantastic, but they're thinking of it more as, like, the one-time hour that they played instead of the whole product. Do you have any, like, ways to think more of a game as a product instead of just a design?
Yeah, that's kind of where the transition from designer to publisher is not necessarily a path for everyone. But I think given that, maybe even tens of thousands of games are released every year, the question is, how does your game stand out from all the others? And there are a lot of different ways that can happen. A lot of people, and the reality is, 99% of the time, your game is not going to have like mind blowing, unique mechanics. And so I think a lot of people try to think, oh, like this is like a whole new type of game. And the reality is, it's not. It's often a combination of a lot of mechanics and things that other people have done before, maybe with a slightly new twist. And this is especially the case for Fantastic Factories. It's admittedly very derivative. It's a combination of a lot of really try and true mechanics put into one package, and so it doesn't bring anything mechanically new to the market. And so um, how do you make that game stand out? And one way is just like art direction is a thing, pricing, components, all those things factor in. But especially for Kickstarter, I think art and theme are really important. So your game basically has to have like some kind of hook, some kind of gimmick, some kind of um, phrase that you can say in 2 sentences why your game is interesting or fun, and that's about as much time and interest you're going to be able to get from the average person who's just browsing through. And so if you can't capture people's attention with just a couple sentences and a graphic or art, then you might not be successful as a Kickstarter campaign as a product. Um, you can look at other games on the shelf. Like one thing I actually did when I was thinking about the cover art for Fantastic Factories, I actually just walked through a board game shop. So I was walking through Blue Highway Games and I was just looking at the shelf. I was like, which one of these games stands out to me? And why does the cover stand out to me? And funny enough, I picked up Islebound, which is by Red Raven Games, and Ryan Lockett is designer, publisher, artist extraordinaire. Anyways, it was funny. I noticed that he also did the cover art as well as designed the game. But yeah, this like for me for Fantastic Factories, I decided a colorful, bold cover. So like a lot of games, especially Euros, they don't have particularly like striking and colorful covers, and I thought there wasn't also enough like vector art in board games. So that's kind of the angle Fantastic Factories took. So I think that the art is, not necessarily the best, but it's different enough. It stands out from other games, and sometimes being different is can be enough to get people to pick up your game, and then hopefully the gameplay will carry it the rest of the way in terms of building up that hype and trust with the consumer.
That's all like such good information. Is there anything else you'd like to add on? Um, about any topic?
Um, that's that's pretty broad a question, but I mean, I just think it's really amazing that people are able to launch Kickstarter board games. It's uh, easier than ever to kind of the bar is rising, but it's with crowdfunding. It's so amazing that we're able to kind of take these ideas and make them into reality, and also the community that's been. And so I don't know, just really excited about where the industry is headed.
I am too. It's always great to see like all the new crazy things that people come up. Because Kickstarter lets a lot of people do things that we wouldn't otherwise be able. So anything exciting happening in the future with your game designs?
Um, I find that putting on the designer hat and the publisher hat repeatedly over and over again can be pretty it's interesting because I'm very momentum based, I think, in some sense. And so for now, after that campaign, taking a little bit of a short break at least, refocusing on my day job as well. And then we have one kind of design that is more just in concept and actual design at this point, but thinking about potentially a co-op kind of version of the game. So it's one of those we found that playing the solo game as a group is actually really interesting. So developing a co-op version that, and we might start spinning off into slightly different themes, but within the same IP and world. But those are just some ideas that have been kind of jumbling around in my brain.
That sounds really exciting. I haven't heard of many engine building co-op, so that would definitely stand out from that. If people want to find you after this, where can they do that?
Yeah, so the best place to find me is on Twitter. My handle is at Fan Factories, because I guess Twitter too many characters for fantastic factories, so it's just fan factories.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on. I really enjoyed talking with you. And if anyone wants to join in the conversation afterwards, we're on Discord at weirddraftgames.com/disc. I hope everyone has a great rest of their weekend. Um, any last words?
No, well, thank you for having me, and everyone have a good weekend.